Long before Rome, before Egypt raised its first pyramid, before the stones of Stonehenge were dragged into place, a civilization was already old in the marshy floodplain between two rivers in what is now southern Iraq. And to understand how it came to be, and how it came to end, we have to start with water, because everything about this story begins and ends with water. High in the mountains of eastern Turkey, storms driven off the Mediterranean collide with the peaks and dump enormous quantities of rain and snow, and that water has nowhere to go but downhill, carving its way through limestone gorges and gathering into two great rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, which run roughly parallel for well over 1,000 miles before finally reaching the Persian Gulf. And along the way those rivers pick up fine mineral particles scoured from the mountain rock, silt, which they carry for hundreds of miles and deposit across a flat, sun-baked plain that would otherwise be desert, turning a landscape with almost no rainfall of its own into some of the most fertile farmland on the planet. And it was on this plain, sometime around the 6th or 5th millennium BC, that farming communities who had been slowly working their way down from the hills finally arrived, bringing with them the accumulated knowledge of thousands of years of experimentation with wheat, barley, and irrigation, and finding a landscape that rewarded that knowledge spectacularly, because although the soil was rich, the region had almost nothing else going for it. No forests for timber, no mountains for stone, no metal ore, nothing but mud, reeds, and water, and it was precisely this scarcity that forced these early settlers to become remarkably inventive, since if you cannot dig stone from the ground you learn to make bricks from river clay and bake them hard in the sun or in kilns. And if you have no wood you learn to bundle reeds into structural beams strong enough to roof a house. And if the rivers only flood the land immediately along their banks, you learn to dig canals to carry water wherever you need it. And it was this last innovation, canal building, that many historians believe was the real engine behind the rise of civilization here, because digging and maintaining a network of irrigation channels is not something one family can do alone. It requires organized labor, someone to plan where the canals go, someone to coordinate work crews, someone to settle disputes when two farmers both want the same water, and someone to keep track of who contributed labor and who is owed grain in return. And out of that administrative necessity, historians argue, grew the first bureaucracies, the first priest-kings, and eventually the first cities, the earliest of which, by the traditions the people themselves would later record, was a settlement called Eridu, founded somewhere in the mid-5th millennium BC. And though the details of its founding are wrapped in myth, describing kings who supposedly reigned for tens of thousands of years, the underlying claim that this was among the very first true urban settlements on Earth is one that archaeology broadly supports, and Eridu was soon joined by sister cities across the southern plain, cities that were culturally united but politically independent, each centered on a temple complex, each ruled by a kind of priest-governor, and each surrounded by fields threaded with irrigation canals whose boundaries were marked with carved stones. And the people who built these cities called themselves, in their own tongue, the black-headed people, and they spoke a language that remains one of the great puzzles of ancient linguistics, because unlike nearly every other language of the ancient Near East, it belonged to no known language family at all. It was not related to the Semitic languages spoken by their neighbors, the Akkadians, nor to anything else we have ever identified. And this strangeness led some later scholars to wonder whether the Sumerians, as we now call them, might have originally come from somewhere else entirely, arriving perhaps by sea, a theory that finds an odd echo in an old Babylonian legend about a fish-tailed being who emerged from the ocean to teach humanity writing, agriculture, and the founding of cities before vanishing back into the waves, though this remains speculation rather than established fact. And whatever their ultimate origin, the Sumerians and their Akkadian neighbors to the north grew increasingly intertwined over the centuries, sharing technology, trade, and eventually a good deal of culture, even as they kept their separate languages. And together they built something genuinely new in human history, because by around 3200 BC, in the city of Uruk, which had grown to become the largest urban center the world had yet seen, someone took the practical problem of tracking grain rations, workers' wages, and temple inventories, and solved it by pressing a cut reed into a small tablet of wet clay to produce a series of simple pictures representing objects and quantities. And though this system started as a memory aid for accountants, it did not stay simple for long. Because as scribes needed to record more abstract information, the pictures gradually became stylized wedge-shaped marks, a script we today call cuneiform. And within a few centuries, those marks had stopped representing whole ideas and started representing sounds, which meant that, for the first time in history, human language itself, not just objects and numbers, could be captured and preserved outside a living memory. A technological leap whose consequences are almost impossible to overstate, since it meant that knowledge no longer had to be relearned from scratch by each generation but could accumulate, be corrected, be built upon. And Uruk at its height sprawled across several square miles, ringed by massive fortified walls that its own poets would later boast about in the world's oldest surviving work of literature, the tale of a legendary king named Gilgamesh. And inside those walls lived tens of thousands of people. A population density unlike anything that had existed before: farmers, herders, brewers, weavers, and a new class entirely, professional scribes, trained for years to master the hundreds of cuneiform signs needed to keep the city's administration running. And life in a Sumerian city was noisy, crowded, and pungent, with kilns and workshops smoking through the day, waste thrown into unpaved streets, and families sleeping on rooftops at night to escape the stifling heat trapped inside mud-brick houses. But it was also, by the standards of the ancient world, remarkably prosperous, because the fertile soil produced far more food than any single Sumerian city needed, generating a surplus that could be traded outward across an extraordinary network reaching from the Mediterranean coast to the Iranian plateau to the Indus Valley civilization far to the east, with grain, dates, wool, and manufactured goods flowing out of Mesopotamia in exchange for copper, tin, silver, gold, timber, and prized stones like lapis lazuli that Sumerian artisans worked into jewelry and inlaid decoration of extraordinary beauty. And nowhere was this wealth more visible than in the city of a port town near where the Euphrates once met the sea, whose royal tombs, when excavated in the 20th century, revealed treasures of gold, silver, and precious stone that testified to a level of craftsmanship and accumulated wealth that stunned the archaeologists who found them. But prosperity of this kind rarely goes unchallenged. And as the 3rd millennium BC wore on, the once largely peaceful landscape of independent city-states increasingly gave way to organized warfare, as cities fought over farmland, water rights, and trade routes. City walls that had once been rare became a near-universal necessity. And rulers began boasting on carved monuments not just of building temples, but of slaughtering rival armies by the thousands. And out of this more violent age eventually emerged a figure whose rise reads like a legend even though he was almost certainly a real historical king. A man named Sargon, said to have been set adrift as an infant in a basket on a river, before rising through the ranks of a royal court to become, first, a cupbearer, and then, through a combination of military daring and political ambition, the conqueror of the entire Sumerian world, founding a new capital city named Akkad, and creating what many historians consider the first true multi-ethnic empire in human history, one that stretched, at least according to his own inscriptions, from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. And Sargon's dynasty ruled for generations. But empires built quickly by conquest often proved difficult to hold together. And the tension between the Akkadian rulers and their Sumerian subjects never fully disappeared, made worse by the fact that Akkadian, being closely related to the languages already spoken across much of the wider region, was simply easier to learn and use in trade and administration than Sumerian, which remained a linguistic island. And so, over the generations, Sumerian speech began a slow retreat, even as Sumerian culture, religion, and learning continued to shape the wider Mesopotamian world. And then, around the 22nd century BC, the Akkadian Empire ran into a crisis it could not survive, as a sudden and severe shift in regional climate, now referred to by researchers simply as an abrupt aridification event, brought a long period of failed rains and reduced river flooding across the entire Near East. A drought so severe and prolonged that it has been linked by researchers to social collapse not only in Mesopotamia, but in Old Kingdom Egypt and the Indus Valley civilization as well. And as harvests failed and hunger spread, the weakened Akkadian state proved unable to defend its borders against raids from mountain peoples to the northeast, and the empire's heartland cities fell into chaos, a period of disorder from which a Sumerian resurgence eventually emerged. Centered once again on the city of whose kings, in a dynasty modern historians number as the third of that city's ruling houses, rebuilt much of Mesopotamia's shattered infrastructure, standardized weights, measures, and even one of the earliest written law codes predating the more famous Babylonian Code of Hammurabi by several centuries, and constructed the great stepped temple towers called ziggurats that became the defining architectural symbol of Sumerian civilization. Monumental structures rising in receding terraces that could be seen from farms many miles away. But even this final flowering of Sumerian power was undermined by a slower, quieter enemy hiding in the very soil that had made the civilization possible in the first place. Because irrigation water, drawn from rivers that had flowed for hundreds of miles over mineral-rich rock, carries dissolved salts, and when that water is spread across fields and evaporates under the fierce Mesopotamian sun, those salts are left behind, and in a landscape with too little rainfall to wash the salt away, it accumulates in the topsoil year after year until crops simply cannot grow. And the archaeological and textual record shows this process happening in agonizing detail, as ancient administrative tablets tracking harvests reveal wheat, which is more sensitive to salt, giving way over the centuries to the hardier but less desirable barley, until eventually wheat all but disappeared from the agricultural record entirely, a silent ecological catastrophe unfolding underneath a civilization already straining under drought, warfare, and administrative overreach. And into this weakened landscape came new waves of pressure from outside. First, the raiding mountain peoples who had already helped bring down the Akkadian Empire, and later a Semitic-speaking pastoral people, the Sumerians, called by a name meaning roughly Westerners, who were themselves being pushed toward the river valley by worsening conditions in the drier lands to the north and west. And the last kings of tried increasingly desperate measures to hold their crumbling state together, building a defensive wall stretching many dozens of miles between the two rivers in an attempt to seal off the agricultural heartland. A wall that ultimately failed for the same reason most such fortifications eventually fail, because it required a permanent, well-supplied garrison that an empire already gutted by famine and rebellion could no longer maintain, and one by one the subject cities of the state broke away, declared independence, or fell to outside conquest, until finally in the final years of the last king of a rising power from the Iranian highlands, the Elamites, marched down out of the mountains, besieged the city, breached its walls, burned its temples, and carried the king himself away into captivity, where he would die in a foreign land. And Sumerian scribes who lived through or shortly after this catastrophe responded the way people so often do in the face of overwhelming loss, by writing poetry, composing long formal laments for their ruined cities that described in vivid and mournful detail the burning temples, the bodies left unburied in the streets, and the sense that the gods themselves had abandoned their people. Laments that were copied and recopied by scribes for centuries afterward as part of their basic education, which is one reason we still have them today. And although the political unity of Sumer never returned after this collapse, the story does not end there, because the wider region did not simply vanish into ruin. Instead, the surviving population, a mixture of displaced Sumerians, the newly arrived Western pastoralists, and the long-established Akkadian-speaking population, gradually blended together over the following centuries. And out of that blending grew the next great powers of the ancient Near East, the empires of Babylon and, later, Assyria, both of which self-consciously positioned themselves as heirs to Sumerian tradition, continuing to use Sumerian as a sacred and scholarly language for religious texts and royal inscriptions for another 2,000 years after ordinary people had stopped speaking it in the streets. Much as Latin would later survive for centuries in European churches and universities long after the fall of Rome, and Sumerian mathematics, particularly its base 60 counting system, left a mark on the world that has never gone away, since it is the reason we still divide a circle into 360 degrees and an hour into 60 minutes each made of 60 seconds. Small everyday fragments of a civilization that otherwise vanished so completely from human memory that for thousands of years afterward, nobody on Earth could read a single word the Sumerians had written, until the 19th and 20th centuries, when archaeologists and linguists, working from tablets excavated at sites like Uruk, Nippur, and painstakingly reconstructed the ability to read cuneiform script, and with it, to read Sumerian itself again for the first time in millennia, and it is because of that painstaking scholarly work that we can now recover, from broken fragments of baked clay dug out of the desert sand, actual voices from the very beginning of urban human civilization, records of grain rations and trade agreements. Yes, but also mathematical texts, medical prescriptions, hymns to the gods, wrenching poems mourning the deaths of kings, and stories about heroes wrestling with the reality of human mortality. And taken all together, the arc of Sumerian history offers something that feels startlingly modern even at a distance of 5,000 years. A story of a society that turned a genuinely hostile environment into extraordinary abundance through irrigation, invention, and cooperation, that built the first cities, the first writing system, the first law codes, and the first great literary works, and that ultimately unraveled under a combination of pressures that would sound familiar to any historian of collapse anywhere in the world: climate change and prolonged drought-straining agricultural systems already pushed to their ecological limits, environmental degradation in the form of slow, self-inflicted soil salination that ancient farmers understood only partially and could slow but never fully solve, external migration and conflict driven in large part by those same environmental pressures pushing outside peoples toward the rivers, and internal political fragmentation as individual cities pursued their own short-term advantage even as the wider civilization they were all part of grew steadily weaker. And it is worth remembering, when we look at the empty, wind-scoured mounds where Uruk, and Eridu once stood, cities that in their day were the largest and most sophisticated human settlements the world had ever produced, that the people who built and lost them were not so different from us. They farmed, they traded, they fell in and out of love. They argued in taverns over the price of grain and complained about ungrateful bosses. They buried their dead with grief and ritual. And in the end they wrote down, on humble tablets of dried river mud, both their triumphs and their sorrow at watching everything they had built slowly slip away, leaving behind, buried for thousands of years beneath the sands of southern Iraq, the first chapter of the long and often repeating human story of civilizations that rise, flourish, and eventually fall.